Okay, sorry, I'm back. So I'm Jenny Lebenz. This semester, I'm the Bildner Visiting Scholar at Rutgers, and the title of this mini course is The End of the World. I'm just making sure my computer, there we go. So why don't I start with, I did not mean to change that screen. Why don't I start with setting up there? Okay, so I figured I'd start with where I'm coming from in teaching this course, what my research is, and we'll orient to that, and probably Nancy will come in and do whatever introductory remarks she intended to do. So my area of focus, in my research, is rabbinic literature of late antiquity. So first we'll situate to what is that literature and what is that time period. We'll start with when late antiquity is. It's basically the first bunch of centuries of the Common Era, from about 200 to about 600. And at least for our purposes, that's what late antiquity is. So this is the highlighted portion right there. And I want to situate us sort of what happens before and what happens after, and why this is such a cool period of time. This is the time period of Talmudic literature, when Judaism, as we know it today, really grew up. This is this highlighted yellow portion, late antiquity. This is after the temple was already destroyed, so we're not in temple times. And it's after the Bible was already written and thought of as the Bible, more or less. This period of late antiquity, this is the classical rabbinic period, the foundation of rabbinic Judaism, which defines all subsequent Judaism, which is to say that after this period, we're no longer a biblical religion, we're not a political entity, but every stage and every form of Judaism that's recognized as part of this religion builds in some way or another on the rabbinic period in late antiquity and participates in the rabbinic tradition in one way or another. One of the things that's really neat about this time period is that it's also the time period of the birth and the early growth of Christianity. So these two religions, in that sense, really grew up together. They know each other, they're interacting with each other. Often we think about Judaism as coming way before Christianity. In certain ways it does, but the Judaism that we know really grew up the same time as, in late antiquity, the same time as Christianity was growing up. And this is all, late antiquity is before the birth of Islam. So even though Islam is going to have a huge impact on Judaism throughout the Middle Ages, which is to say subsequent centuries from late antiquity, at this stage that we're focusing on, that I focus on in my research, Islam doesn't exist yet. Now, there are other religions that Jews of this time period were living among. Zoroastrianism is one, pagan religions. But really, I suppose because I live in a majority Christian society, and because this period of formative rabbinic Judaism and formative Christianity really so perfectly overlaps, I'm especially interested in comparing and contrasting and looking at the relationship between rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity. So I hope you're with me so far. So this is late antiquity. And so now let's talk about this rabbinic literature, the reason why this period is called the classical rabbinic period. So it's called rabbinic literature, classical rabbinic literature, sometimes Talmudic literature. And it's actually a whole mess of books. The Talmud is the biggest one of those books. And because it's the last to be compiled and edited, it builds on everything that came before it, which is why the whole body of literature is often called Talmudic literature. But there's actually not only the Talmud, there are two Talmuds, one produced in the land of Israel and one produced in Babylonia, which is modern day Iraq, but was then part of the Persian Empire. And then there are all lots of smaller collections, some focused on law, some focused on biblical interpretation. But like I said, it's a whole mess of books, and we won't get lost in the nitty-gritty of which books and which particular styles. But there is this body of literature. And it's produced over the course of the several centuries of late antiquity. So I see that Nancy has arrived, and my initial stage setting is complete. Should I unshare my screen for you, Nancy?
No, I think as long
Okay.
as you got formally introduced by
I did not.
yourself
By myself,
um,
yes.
or someone else, and my apologies for New Jersey Transit, but yes. Anyway, please continue, Jenny.
Oh, okay. Um, all right. Oh, so at this stage though, I did want to encourage people to put, I'm gonna, when I finish the larger stage setting, I'm gonna pause for clarification questions because these are a lot of sort of details. So if you're having some clarification questions that you have, start to put them in the chat, and then in a few minutes, um, I'll pause to speak to that. Okay. All right. Sorry, I'm just moving things on my screen so that they're in a convenient place for me. Okay, so here we are at this topic of the end of the world in rabbinic literature of late antiquity. So why am I talking about this topic? What's my interest in this topic? I have a forthcoming book set to come out in 2025. And for the past many years that I've been working on this book, people naturally ask the sort of obvious question of what is your book about? And I used to just say the end of the world. And that's also the title of the course I teach about it at St. Francis College, and obviously this mini course. And here you can fill in all the sardonic comments about how the end of the world is so very timely. But the thing is that the book and what I've been studying is not really about that. So then I briefly told people that the book is about the world to come. But it's also not really about that. I'm not interested in describing the world to come per se. Really, what this book and this study is about that I want to share with you is the ideas that sort of circle around these concepts of the end of the world and the world to come, sort of the soil in which those ideas grow. And you see that word eschatology in the title of my book, which we'll get back to, because that's the word that allows us to dig into what we're really talking about when we're talking about the end of the world or the world to come. But let's stay for a little while with the end of the world, because I still think it's the most readily accessible term to start with for what we're going to talk about. So think about what the end of the world, the term, the end of the world, what it evokes. What do we think about when we hear that? So probably for a lot of people, it comes along with thoughts about global catastrophe, say a pandemic or a climate upheaval or a world war. But let's actually skip past that, because that's imagined often as the thing that brings about the end. So shift out of the general mindset of looking around at the hot mess that is today's world as the end of the world, or maybe for optimists, not the end of the world, and shift into a religious mindset that invented the idea of an end that is meaningful and desirable in some way. And what are the kinds of things that one expects for the end of the world? So I'll give you a moment to think of what those things are. Here's what I'm going to tell you people think of as what one expects. So first of all, divine judgment, a final judgment from God of all people. Also, resurrection of the dead, right? The end of death, the conquest of death. But it's also the start of something new, right? The world to come or whatever. So the end times, the inauguration of some kind of end times, which is an odd way to refer to it when we're thinking about it really as the beginning times. This is one of the many problems with the phrase the end of the world, because there's also a beginning to it. But these sorts of ideas are very common both in antiquity and today, for what comes to mind with the end of the world. And I deal with all these things in my book, and these are the that's the framing of the three sessions of this course. But the problem with referring to it as the end of the world is that thinking about it as the thing or a set of things that come at the end of a timeline with a hard stop. And the timeline looks like this simple straight arrow with a beginning and an end. And see, the problem is that then these really interesting and robust ideas of judgment and resurrection and the inauguration of something new, they get sort of kind of shrunk down and pinned to this one moment on the timeline or after the timeline, as though they have no relationship at all to all the stuff before. And that's where the word eschatology can really help, even though it doesn't exactly roll off the tongue the way end of the world certainly does. Because we're going to see in a moment that eschatology helps us to not shrink these really interesting ideas into these and pin them at the end of a timeline. So this is not a particularly common word, so we're going to spend some time on this word. Eschatology is the academic term for the study of the end of the world stuff. Now, eschatology is obviously an English word, but it comes from Greek, the Greek word eschatos. And now that's usually translated, and for hundreds of years has been translated as last things, which of course doesn't get us much past the end of the world, pinning all these relevant ideas to the end of that timeline. But the word itself, eschatos, is way more interesting than that. Let me show you, and don't worry if you can't see the details so clearly. I want to show you for effect. The entry for eschatos in the Greek-English dictionary that's most commonly used by scholars of ancient Greek. There is a lot there. Now, last is one of the options, right down over there. But we need to look at the much wider range of meanings besides last that's in this word eschatos, which is the ancient Greek word that all of these ideas are sort of attached to and coming from. There's all these different words, farthest, you don't have to be able to, again, read them on the screen. I'm going to read them out. But we have farthest, uttermost, extreme, hindmost, uppermost, innermost. Again, uttermost comes up twice. Highest, utmost, that's my favorite one, the utmost. The last, yes, but also the worst. It's a super flexible word. And it would have been a lot better, I think, for our understanding of well, eschatology, all this end of the world stuff, if it would have been a lot better if modern English authors hadn't started translating eschatos as last things. Because the ancient texts that talk about all this stuff, they're doing a lot more than just saying what comes last on the timeline. So I have a better way of defining eschatology than the study of the last things. There has to be a way of describing all the things that fall into the category of this end of the world stuff without falling into the trap of pinning it to the end of a timeline and reducing it in that way. In the ancient Jewish and Christian texts that I've spent quite a long time reading through and sort of sitting with, when they talk about the world to come or the kingdom of God or the end of the world, I think what they're really describing is not just another future world, but the best of all possible worlds. And here's what I think that term captures that matches up so well with what we find in the ancient texts. The best of all possible worlds is something that is sort of known as out there somewhere, somehow, in reality. And we want to touch it, but we're not entirely touching it just yet. It's separate from this world in a meaningful way, but importantly, it's real. And this other world isn't just an alternative, it's ideal. And that doesn't mean perfect, at least not for the rabbis. It's ideal in the sense that it's the best that's possible while still being real. And the best of all possible worlds is not necessarily to be found on a timeline. It can be revealed or accessed in a whole slew of ways. It might be on a timeline. It's not that it can't be what happens later. It's that it doesn't always have to be. And the laterness, the end of the timeline-ness, isn't necessarily the most important thing about whatever we're talking about with regard to the best of all possible worlds, the eschaton. So the noun for the thing we're talking about is the eschaton. And instead of the end of the world, I'm calling it the best of all possible worlds. On a practical level, thinking about the eschaton as the best of all possible worlds changes the nature of the questions we ask about it. So think about the end of the world. What questions might we pose about the end of the world? Well, we might say, when is it? Will I survive it? What's going to happen to make it the end? Whereas I think with the best of all possible worlds, our questions can be different. Can be, what is the best of all possible worlds like? How similar is it to this world or different? And we can concretize that shift a bit better, even if when we turn to the specific topic that we'll talk about for the rest of this evening, which is divine judgment. So when we're talking about God's judgment, which is a sort of staple part of eschatological thinking about this end of the world stuff. Long before the rabbis and long after, there's this very entrenched concept of divine judgment. So we could talk about it as divine judgment at the end of the world or in the best of all possible worlds. The kinds of questions that I think are naturally connected to divine judgment at the end of the world are, will I be saved or condemned? Will they be saved or condemned? What will the outcome be? Whereas when we talk about it as divine judgment in the best of all possible worlds, I think the questions shift to, what would the judgment process be like? What criteria would be important? Who would be involved? Because sort of at the end of the world has a sort of static single event resonance to it, where everything points to that. And then we get there and it kind of concludes, right? But that's sometimes the way ancient authors, Jews and Christians, wrote about divine judgment, but they also really thought about the world, what they would call the world to come. So it's described in terms of something that happens later, but this other world, the best of all possible worlds, they describe it as a whole world. So we have to think about not just what's the event of judgment that happens, but what is the nature of judgment in that world? And that's going to yield some really interesting answers when it comes to rabbinic texts. So this is where, like I said, I want to pause if people have put in clarification, questions, because I've talked a lot about late antiquity and rabbinic literature and eschatology. And if now's a good time, if Nancy, if you had other things you wanted to put in the intro, hello to everyone.
So one thing is, some people raise their hands, and you need to put your questions into the chat because I can't call on you in this form. So please do that. And we do have a question that someone, it was a comment when you asked about, what people imagine the end of time or the end of days to be. And someone mentioned a messianic age, again, a very fraught, complex term, of good times and peace. So kind of the utopian, very positive. So can you address that in terms of, I mean, the best of all possible worlds sounds like rock and roll, the good old days. But so can you talk about that for a minute, where that is in your
Yeah, pardon the flipping of slides, but Absolutely. So, although it's an interesting thing that I encourage you to plumb, that you said the good old days.
Right. Yeah, yeah.
Interesting. So that's what I meant by sort of the inauguration of the end time, some sort of vague idea of this new time period, right? And people invest uh, a lot in that, whether it's a return to old times or whether it's sort of peace and goodness and peace and love and everything. That's for sure. That's for sure. I think one of the important things. So that when we talk about when we get to the third of this session. So we're going to talk about a little bit about what that means for the rabbis, but not in the sense of, like I said, when I've been working on this book, I'm not so interested in describing the world to come, just because how many different ways can you say it'll be great? But what it means to describe the world to come and certain really interesting aspects of it that the rabbis express. Yeah.
Okay, so we have a couple of other questions and so or comments. So let me just throw them out, and if you want to riff on them a little bit. So one person commented, and I had thought about this too, and didn't ask you earlier this morning about it. When you call this the best of all possible worlds, the person said you think about Leonard Bernstein's Candide, but of course, in Candide, Voltaire, right? Voltaire is making fun of
Leibniz.
Leibniz. So where, just do you want to reflect on that a little bit? Or do you, someone just commented, do you think is that language the best of all possible worlds in the text, or is this your compilation, your phraseology based on the way you think they're thinking about the end of time?
The latter, and I'm borrowing the phrase from Leibniz, and there are some important similarities and differences. So Leibniz was this 18th century polymath philosopher who he called this world the best of all possible worlds, and that was his theodicy, which means that's how he justified God's goodness in the face of evil in the world. And he theorized that there's all these other possible worlds. This is the best one, including, not despite, but including all of the evil that exists in it. And so God did do the best God could possibly do for us. So, and then there were like earthquakes and floods, and Voltaire made fun of him because this world is terrible. Like, I really hope this isn't the best of all possible worlds. Leibniz coined the term optimism to describe his theodicy. So what it has not in common, where the concept I'm talking about is different from Leibniz, is that this world is not it, or at least not entirely it. But what it shares a great deal of optimism with Leibniz, in that we'll see that now I'm anticipating myself a little too much. So it is an optimistic view of the world, but also that it has limits. This is a really important aspect of saying something is the best, it's as good as it gets, or whether it's this world or the other world is the best of all possible worlds. That's what distinguishes it from sort of utopian imagination, which is fun, but it's what the rabbis and early Christians are doing when they're talking about what we normally call the end of the world, is not just sort of, or the world to come, is not just sort of thinking of the greatest things they can think of, because it's something that they're really committed to the realness of. There's limits on it. So it's the best of all things possible to be real. This is not the language that any ancient writers used. So I'm adopting that phraseology because I think it really captures the full range of ways in which ancient authors talk about the eschaton. It can include within it the very temporal, very sort of linear end of the timeline, later on reality. It can include something that's accessible right now. And it can include something that's there for everyone or that's there for a certain group. So it's really, to me, it emerged very late in the process of this, something like 12 years of working on this material, very late in the process, as I was working out how on earth can we describe what they're all talking about in a way that actually describes all of it, not just, the Christian view or a Jewish view.
So we have a couple more questions, and you can take them or not, or comments. Okay. And I'm gonna bundle them because I think
Sure.
So one person said, are they correct in thinking that the major event of the end times is worldwide knowledge of God? Sounds very Aleinu-like, but that's a comment. And the other is, are there correlations between the end of the world and the end of life or afterlife, views of heaven, reincarnation, etc.? And I think you're going to address those. So one is one of the end goals, this idea of knowledge of God, which of course has a long thread in Jewish philosophic thinking. And the other is the relationship between the end of the world and this thing called the afterlife or heaven or reincarnation. So you have resurrection as your, go for it. See how you want to link those things from these questions. And thank you everyone for your questions. Jenny is going to answer them, and then she's going to continue, and we'll have a pause at the end where you can ask some more questions. And remember, we have 2 more sessions too. So yeah.
Thank you. So the worldwide knowledge of God, or knowledge of God that isn't worldwide, but for some people at least, is for sure a part of the inauguration of the end times, that third thing, that new world, that the new world that's envisioned. It's not the only one. I think it certainly resonates through liturgical texts, like, as Nancy said, the Aleinu. So knowledge of God is a big part of it. Not one that, you know what, in the third session, we're going to actually deal with that quite a bit. In terms of afterlife, so there are important points of contact between ideas about the afterlife and end of the world thinking, but fewer than you would think. So the area that I'm studying is not what happens to individuals after death. The rabbis have a lot of things to say about that, but it's very, very different, and different in tone to their ideas about the best of all possible worlds. And when we talk about resurrection, we'll talk about, what it means for dead people, because there are objectively dead people now, right? And obviously, if things are going to be as good as possible, the best of all possible worlds, there can't be death, because that's the worst. So yeah, I'll sort of put that off till I think we'll have good conversation about that on the topic of resurrection. So pardon as I might as well recommend a book. So since this course isn't really about afterlife, this just happens to be on my shelf right in front of me. There's a wonderful book, which I was surprised at how wonderful it is. I don't know where it's going to come into or out of the blur, but it's called Jewish Views of the Afterlife by Simcha Paul Raphael. And it covers not just antiquity, but it's really delightful and accurate and erudite. And if that is of interest, I recommend Jewish Views of the Afterlife by Simcha Paul Raphael. It does not overlap much at all with my research. So pardon me as I scroll real fast to where we got to. We have different, okay, this is where we were. All right, so let's turn to this question of, in the best of all possible worlds, what does divine judgment look like for the rabbis of late antiquity? But before we look at the rabbinic texts, it's important that we think about what our instincts tell us the answer might be, just like we've already started to do. And more important even than that specifically is the question of where our expectations come from. And I'm going to suggest in a moment that a lot of our expectations come from Christianity. Because we live in a world suffused with Christian eschatology. It's woven into the fabric of popular culture, but it comes from a Christian perspective. And I'm going to show you some of the expectations that come to us from New Testament texts, the earliest writings of Christianity. So this is before we get to the rabbinic texts. I think you'll see as you think to yourself specifically about divine judgment that it might be the case, and you can tell me later if I'm totally wrong, that a lot of it comes from a New Testament judgment imagery. So we'll look at two texts from there are lots of passages about this sort of thing in the New Testament, but we'll look at two particularly central and important ones that get referred to a lot by later by Christian writers over time. So the first one is from Matthew. And he's describing what's going to happen in the end times. All the nations will be gathered before him, before God, and he will separate people from one another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at the left. So this metaphor, this parable of the sheep and the goats, as it's called, assumes sort of God already knows who everybody is and where everybody belongs, and all the people come, and as easy as it is and natural as it is to move sheep and goats to each side, God just puts the good people and the bad people over to the side. The king will say to those at his right hand, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world." So there is this invitation, but it's very sort of surface rhetorical, because it's not saying, whoever thinks that they should come, you show some initiative. In this model, in the Gospel of Matthew, the good have been separated from the bad, and then God turns to the good and says, "Great, let's go." A different sort of text is in Revelation. Revelation is a vision text. So the author of Revelation has this very extended, very full vision of things that are understood to be eschatological. So at this one point, he says in chapter 20, towards the end, what happened? There we go. Then I saw, so it's written in the first person. The author is describing what he saw in this vision. I saw a great white throne and the one who sat on it. That's God. The earth and the heaven fled from his presence, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Also another book was opened, the book of life. And the dead were judged according to their works, as recorded in the books. And the sea gave up the dead that were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them, and all were judged according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire. So in Revelation, this description of the last judgment features books that already contain all the necessary evidence, the works of each and every human being, and whether they belong in the book of life or the book of death. There's no pen, there's no debate, there's no determination. Judgment refers at once to determination, sentence, and punishment. Early Christian writers routinely relied on this description from Revelation in how they thought about divine judgment. Eschatological punishment here is not the result of a decision made by God, but a sort of necessary correlation between reality and its consequences ordained by God. There's no room for adjudication or argument. God just applies reality. So two really important characteristics of a Christian view of divine judgment that these exemplify are autocracy and certainty. And autocracy means God is an autocrat. God rules alone and judges alone and is the only one who has any power or control over the situation. And certainty, meaning that everything is determined according to what has already been written. Essentially, like I said, divine judgment just applies correct knowledge to reality. If you're guilty, you're punished. And there's no question about whether or not you're guilty or innocent and rewarded. Basically, everything is certain, everything is already determined, and God is the sole actor in applying that reality. What I want to show you the rest of tonight is a dramatic alternative that we find in rabbinic texts. In rabbinic eschatological judgment, we find collaboration. The rabbis presented an alternative to this autocratic view of divine eschatological judgment that was, the autocratic view was widespread in both Jewish and Christian texts before and during the time of the rabbis. So that existing model was God's perfection, God is perfect, and that should logically mean that divine judgment is perfect. It should be self-sufficient, autocratic, and automatic. Instead, what stands out in rabbinic eschatological judgment is the involvement of considerable human agency and argumentation and flexibility even on the part of God. In fact, the rabbis imagined eschatological judgment as resembling this worldly rabbinic judgment with all of its imperfections as a collaborative project. So now it's time to read through some texts. I'm going to go through them sort of slowly and explain as I go. If you miss one, don't worry, you'll get the next one. There's a bunch. So for all the texts, for those who are familiar with the corpus of rabbinic literature, I'm labeling where these things come from. But if you're not familiar with the particular texts, don't worry at all about it. These are all late antique rabbinic texts from the various edited compilations that exist in that literature. So we'll start with this first one from the Palestinian Talmud. And all the first sets of texts we're going to talk about deal with invitation to divine judgment that is not just that rhetorical invitation that we saw in Matthew, where God made the decisions and then says, let's go, right? It's not really let's go as in, would you like to come with me? It's really a different kind of invitation that happens in rabbinic texts. So this first text reads, Rabbi Yirmiyah ben Elazar said, in the future, and that's the rabbinic, one of the several rabbinic sort of codes, key terms that tells you we're talking about the eschaton. So obviously there is some, the way they express it is as though it's at the end of a timeline. But the larger picture that I've studied tells me that we shouldn't take it too literally in that sense. But that's the term that tells you we're not just talking about what God does on any given day, but in the best of all possible worlds. In the future, a heavenly voice will call out among the tents of the righteous and say, whoever acted with God should come and take their reward. Now, before I even comment on that, I just want to show you the next one, which is very similar with little differences. In another text, it says, in the future, the Spirit of holiness will call out at the tops of the mountains, saying, who acted with God? Whoever acted with God should come and take their reward. So what we see here is that God is not pulling people together and separating them on his own. And I say his because in the rabbinic imagination and lexicon, it's always going to be a male figure. God is actually, the second text puts a finer point on it, that God is asking a question that people have to actively come and answer and participate in the process. You can't have the process without participation. Now, we'll see that this really isn't just rhetorical. The next two texts show that sometimes that went wrong. That didn't go the way maybe God had originally planned, or it certainly doesn't move the process of final judgment of all of humanity in the way that we would expect. So this is actually quite a famous text in the Babylonian Talmud. In the future to come, that's another way that they phrase what I would say in the best of all possible worlds. The Holy One, blessed be he, brings a Torah scroll and sets it in his lap and says, let everyone who occupied themselves with this come and take their reward. Okay, so God clearly has a plan and an ideal situation of who deserves reward. It's if you occupied yourself with Torah. Then things take a turn, though. Immediately, all the nations of the world assemble. The kingdom of Rome enters first. They say to him, Master of the universe, we, the Romans, established many marketplaces. We built many bathhouses. We accumulated gold and silver. And we only did all of this for Israel so that they could occupy themselves with the Torah. The kingdom of Persia enters after it, and they say to him, we constructed many bridges, we conquered many cities, we made many wars, and we only did all this for Israel so that they could occupy themselves with Torah. And so too with each and every nation. Now, this is actually a much longer text that God then has to go back and forth. There's a whole trial. These particular arguments, God says pretty quickly, no, you didn't. You did that for yourselves. No credit on that score. But they continue this argument back and forth that shows us that God is very much not an autocrat, and not even just a judge. God sort of plays lots of roles in the fallout from this. God is certainly the bailiff. God is the judge, a lawyer. God at certain points gets criticized by the nations for making an impossible system for them to succeed. This is very different from that autocratic, automatic, self-sufficient divine judgment where it's just sort of a law of nature that correct punishment and reward is doled out at the end of time. This text, the next one, is more of the same, but I find this to be delightfully revealing. In the coming future, another way of phrasing the signal that we're in the eschaton, the Holy One, blessed be he, takes a karos. This is the Greek word for essentially a megaphone, and announces, saying, all those who did not eat pig meat in their life shall come and take their reward. Now, this is an interesting invitation because when God said, if you occupied yourself with Torah, you get reward, that seems at least to be open-ended in the sense that the Torah symbolizes, right, everything that God wants from the world, let's say. Here, it's clear that God has in mind the distinctive nation that people always think of as those who don't eat pork. But what happens? Many of the nations of the world who didn't eat pig meat in their lives, they come to take their reward. And what happens now? God is upset. His plan didn't work out. At that moment, the Holy One, blessed be he, says, they're being rewarded with two worlds. It's not enough for them that they consumed their world, but they want to consume the world of my children as well. Now, what's happening here? It's a little tricky because God made the invitation, but God didn't seem to see how it was going to play out. God has a plan. We know that the plan that's portrayed here is that God wanted the world to come, the reward here that people are coming to take, to belong to the people of Israel, God's children. Right? He refers to, in the text, he refers to the world to come as the world of my children. This world is the world where all the other nations thrived, but God created an alternative world that's just for the children of Israel. And God is upset that when it came time to do the invitation to judgment, the wrong people came. But instead of just sort of vaporizing them, there is a deep commitment to portraying a judgment process that involves agency, human agency, and invitation. So God solves the problem. At that moment, the Holy One, blessed be he, takes out a karos, again, a megaphone, and announces a second time, all those who did not eat carrion or terefa, flesh of an animal that did not die by means of proper slaughter, those who did not eat insects and bottom crawlers shall come and take their reward. And there's no person who didn't eat carrion or terefa, insects and bottom crawlers. If they didn't eat their own, they ate of their friends. So God has a plan, but God has to still go through the process of creating a standard, articulating that standard, and then having the people to whom it applies come forward. I actually want to skip this text because I see that we're doing okay on time, and I want to make sure to get to the one more thing. So a phrase that's repeated over and over is what's supposed to happen is that people are supposed to give justification and accounting. It's an active verb, and this is not paralleled in its usage, at least, is not paralleled in Christian texts. It's also the same phrase as is used in everyday sort of judgment. So the invitation, the goal is for people to participate in giving their own justification of themselves. They're accounting for how they acted in the world, not just for God to judge. So to sort of summarize what we've seen so far, we have a promotion of argumentation, collaboration, and even learning. The text that really shows God learning sort of comes next. And what we don't have is this kind of perfect divine truth, where total divine power is expressed and autocratic, omniscient decisions, where God brings to bear all of the knowledge that God has. So it seems to me now is a good time to pause for questions before concluding.
Yes, we have some wonderful questions, and I'm very tempted to ask one, but I will behave and wait till the end. So let me scroll up a little bit. There were really some very engaged questions. So this is a big one, and I'll throw it out. I'll give you the question. You'll see if you want to address it, if you feel like it's so. One of our participants says, thinking about the end of the world also requires thinking about its beginnings. Does antiquity and the text that you study have a relatively common belief in the age of the world? What are the guesses about the age of the world? And does anyone consider that there is no beginning, or that the beginning is unimaginably far in the past? So this is a question about, if we're thinking about the end or some future time, where does it begin? So that's, I'm going to give you a few questions. You decide what you want to answer. So that's one question. The other question is really a very contextual question, very excellent question. I think the other one was excellent too. But one of the participants says she believes, I think correctly, that most of the earliest New Testament writers were Jews or came out of a Jewish substrate, right? But they were Jesus-loving or Jesus-believing Jews. So are the rabbinic views that are collaborative, as you noted, in part, are they represented dissent from an earlier set of Jewish views? How do you understand the beginning? I guess I'm adding to the question, the beginning of what later in the 4th and 5th century we call the parting of the ways, right? Where is there some kind of polemic about these different sets of views?
Yeah. I want to jump in briefly on that one, just to clarify.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes.
Yeah.
My finding is that rabbinic ideas about divine judgment as collaborative are distinctive of the rabbinic period of thinking about eschatology. Second Temple period Jews before the time of the rabbis, and some writers during the time of the rabbis who were separate from that sort of intellectual group, have their own writings. They do express the same sorts of autocratic divine judgment that we find in those early Christian texts. And what I didn't bring examples because it's too much, but from the early Christian writings that parallel the rabbis, that do a lot of the they parallel in time, I'm sorry, but they do a lot of echoing of that text from Revelation, and they see it very much as an automatic process. There are outliers, but those need to be studied more as well. So yeah, it's a distinctive Jewish view of this period, not the eternal Jewish view from before, because you're exactly right about the early New Testament writers.
So it's a post-destruction until codification view, 2nd century to 5th?
2nd to 6th or so.
2nd to 6th. Okay, good. So I think, I want to just sort of shout out to everyone you're seeing here the historian's mind. That's Professor Leben's, not me, even though you know who I am. saying that the conclusions that she's making are from this very interesting and complex corpus, but this rabbinic corpus, the rabbinic period corpus from the 2nd to the 6th century. And there are people in the world who think, well, rabbinic Judaism begins in the the Second Temple, or with, Ezra. But Jenny, meaning believing Jews want to see some kind of continuum, right?
Sure. So the traditional view is to project that backwards to
Right.
Sinai.
Right, exactly.
But historically, they are situated in a particular time and place.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, we have a couple. I don't know if you want to address the big question about the beginning of time.
Well, there's actually a short answer.
Sure, go ahead.
When it comes to timelines, they're writ large, they're very clear. There are, for Jews and Christians, for non-Jews and non-Christians, there's all manner of ideas and eternity and everything like that. But Jews and Christians are clear that God is eternal, but God created the world at a distinct point in time. And we'll talk about the other major. So the cosmic timeline is really one of the major themes of the 3rd session in this course.
Great. Okay, so a couple more questions, and then if you want to conclude or sum up or something. So someone asked, if people get to self-identify, right, in this end time, can they lie and say they have not eaten terefa or pig meat? And if not, isn't this really autocratic and street theater, since God is still making the decision?
That's a great question. So first I'll say that the yes to the latter. It is always the case that, God is the puppet master and God is setting the criteria and God does, rig the scenes. But the thing that's really striking, and there's a whole bunch of narratives about this, or that demonstrate this, is that the trial proceeds, like there are conversations that go on. And one of the ways in which I read rabbinic texts that I talk about in the introduction to the book, like the method of reading, is that if we just focus on the outcome, we're going to miss a lot of the drama of a long text that has lots of ups and downs in it. So in that text from the Babylonian Talmud that I shared about how all the nations come and try to say that they deserve eschatological reward because, they did things for the sake of the Jews, they do in the end. God says you're out, you lose. Although there are other texts where it doesn't have the outcome that we expect. But take one that has the outcome that we expect, like you said. Oh, what am I going to do? I ate pig, so I can't get reward. Nevertheless, the commitment to the process of judgment is demonstrated by the sort of trial and conversation that goes on. And that, I mean, if unless there was another pressing question, I will just, I'm going to skip ahead a bit. Skipping some things.
Yeah, go ahead. Why don't you, and I'm going to say to everyone out there, some of the questions that people are asking, I think they will there will be information that will reverberate later.
Yeah.
So if you can hold on to your questions, if they, someone asked about resurrection, we're going to have next session is devoted to that. So I hope there'll be opportunities for you to ask them, but let's let Professor Lebens continue with sort of her summation slides and what she wants to teach us.
So let me see, just because I'm just looking at my notes because I skipped a few things because the questions were so generative. What we've seen is that divine eschatological judgment, the way in which the rabbis imagine God turning to judge humanity in the best of all possible worlds, actually looks a lot like the way judgment happens in this world. It's cooperative. There's a process. Sometimes it's not fair. There's give and take a lot of the time. So the question really is, why would that be? And to answer that, we have to realize that the kind of judgment that they're modeling here is, again, rabbinic judgment. The rabbis are teachers and scholars and authors, but most of what they do is judgment, right? Dealing with cases between individuals or talking about how such cases should be dealt with. So what they're saying in creating this tapestry of judgment scenes and judgment texts, where the best of all possible worlds looks just like this world, they're saying that, yeah, in the best of all possible world, divine judgment looks a lot like rabbinic judgment. And then if that's the case, then we can actually access or experience a piece of the best of all possible worlds right now in this world, right? We can do that by engaging in rabbinic processes, being rabbinic Jews, according to the rabbis. They're saying, in a way, sure, this world overall isn't the best of all possible worlds. A lot of things are really rotten, in fact, but some parts of it actually are. And we shouldn't imagine that the rabbinic way of life and dealing with questions, judgment questions, is just a concession to the brokenness of this world. And we shouldn't imagine an entirely other way in which God will come at us at the end of the world. No, when God wants to use the best possible form of judgment, God uses the rabbinic form of judgment. Now, you might say, especially the whoever wrote the last question, I'm sure is thinking, that's pretty narcissistic. And maybe it is. The rabbis were not known for their humility, but it's also why they're doing what they're doing. They believe that the Torah and the Jewish traditions of interpreting and living by it was God's gift to the world, and that it's a precious gift because it contains within it the best of all possible worlds. It's the portal to the best of all possible worlds. So it's not and they view rabbinic judgment and all their processes as Torah, just the extension of it. So it's not a morose, this is as good as it gets, but a wildly optimistic view that the best is in part already here at our fingertips if we choose to engage in it. I want to be mindful of people's times. I'm happy to chat a little longer, but it's since it's 8.
Thank you. I'm trying to see if there are other questions that I jumped over only because, and again, you may, one of the questions is about resurrection, and I think we'll leave that to next week. Someone wanted to ask about the image of this thing called heaven and this thing called hell. How do they fit into the rabbinic and Christian notions of the end of the world as the best of all possible worlds? And then we'll,
It's a great question because it's another instantiation of the screen that you see in front of you, like the issue of how literally to take things. So I think, so the rabbis and the early Christians talk about, well, the world to come, and the rabbis will talk about Gehenna, which is essentially hell. So either you get the good one or you get the bad one. But the way in which they talk about that, how you get there, the steps, are surprising in lots of ways, where the rabbis don't talk about life as well, they have one or two here and there, but in general, in the plethora of different kinds of texts in which they talk about in the future to come, in the coming future, what will happen, how will God judge, it's not a straight line to the world to come or hell. Just like, okay, the end of the world, the future to come, you could say it as, all right, well, obviously they said the future to come, so they mean like whatever's at the end of the timeline, but the course of what they say shows that in little and more extensive ways, that there's a lot more going on than just sorting and determining.
Okay, thank you so much. So I want to, first of all, thank everyone. We've had a wonderful group of people here, and I hope I'll see you next week and the week after. So let me make the formal announcements and maybe then sum up a little bit. So we have 2 more sessions of this course on the end of the world. Next week, same time, but on time, 7 o'clock to 8, Tuesday, December 10th. And the theme of that is resurrection. The 3rd session, which is the following week on Tuesday, December 17th, the theme is the inauguration of the end times. So by the way, everyone, this is going to give there's a how-to manual here. You want the best of all possible worlds, you can prep. This is like preparatory. So please join us. You're registered, and you can also spread the word to other people. Also, as soon as Professor Lebens tells us when her book is forthcoming, maybe we even might have, let you know when Oxford is going to bring it out, because you'll be able to see then. Some people have asked Professor Lebens for actually specific citations. You mentioned the Mechilta, the Besikta. Some people are knowledgeable enough. And also in today's world, you can go on Sefaria and you can find a lot of these, whether or not the translations are up to snuff, but you can find things easily, or more easily back in the day than you could back in the day when you had to open up a book that you found in a library. Or
I would be happy to collate a source sheet with details and
that would be
shared.
just wonderful, and we can share that on the website. That'd be fantastic. So I want to just thank the staff. I want to thank Sarah Portillo, our program coordinator, Robin Auerbach, our program coordinator, Darcy Marr, who does all the publicity. She's the one who helps prepare the e-blast. That's how you know about these things. If for some reason you're not formally on the Bildner Center list, please make sure you get on them, because this kind of quality course, as you can hear from our incredible visiting scholar, are the kind of things we offer the public all year. So please join us, as well as our in-person events. And on that note, we have a very, very special, I like to think everything we do is special, but we have a particularly unusual special event on January 26th. The Bildner Center is in partnership with the McCarter Theater Center, which is based in Princeton, New Jersey. And we are inviting you to a special performance of a play called Here There Are Blueberries. And it will feature a post-show discussion and private reception. And tickets are available online through the Bildner Center website. And just to give you a sense, the title, Here There Are Blueberries, sounds very bucolic, but it is about an extraordinary photographic album that was discovered and sent anonymously to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And then it was dated and identified by one of the archivist scholars there, Rebecca Erbelding, who then went on to write an extraordinary book on the War Refugee Board. And the book of photographs was produced simultaneously. It was like the home album of German Nazis. So the blueberries are bucolic, because what's on the other side of the walls obviously is horrifying. So it's a very complex and moving play, and we have a special arrangement with McCarter. So please look on our website, and that's January 26th. So again, join us for the next two sessions. I want to thank again Professor Jenny Lebens, who is the Allen Bildner Visiting Scholar this fall. And I hope she mentioned that the book she produced because of the time we're just thrilled about, because that is the whole idea of having a visiting scholar. Not only someone bringing this kind of erudition and excitement and depth to the public in topics that we, the faculty, and others do for with our own projects, but also giving someone like Professor Lebens the time to, away from her demanding teaching schedule, to be able to get her own work done. And we just are thrilled that the book is forthcoming from Oxford University Press. It's incredibly exciting. So thank you, everyone. See you next week, 7 o'clock, Tuesday night. Good night.